Hi, this is Dr. David Branham. I hope you are all having a great semester. Today we're going to cover the Electoral College, and the name of the presentation is the Electoral College, Controversy and Electoral College, Bias and Controversy in American Presidential Elections. And we'll just get started and go right away. Okay, in the Electoral College, there is a vote distribution where each state gets a certain number of votes. So each state gets one electoral vote per congressional representative. And that is one for each member of the United States House of Representatives and one for each senator. So each state automatically gets two because every state has two senators, regardless of their population and size. House members, House of Representative members are determined by your population. So every state gets at least one, regardless of your population. So if your population isn't large enough to get a House of Representatives member normally, you automatically get one. However, most states have many more than just one because their population is higher. So those representatives are determined by population. There's 435 House members. So your population, if you have, for instance, 10% of the population, then you get 43 or 44 House members. So here on the board is from the 2020 census, how many representatives and senators each state gets, and that determines their electoral vote. So you can see the highest number is in California, which has 54. Texas is second with 40. That means we have 38 House members in Texas. We have two senators. California has 52 House members and two senators. You can see there's small states like Wyoming, which is in the West, and also North and South Dakota. They have three. That means that they have one House of Representatives member and they have two senators. They're very small states population-wise. So this is how the vote is distributed in the Electoral College. The one exception is Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is not a state, and originally they did not have any electoral votes. So they made an amendment where that Washington, D.C. would get three electoral votes. And this three is regardless of population in D.C. They would, according to population, get three electoral votes. If they were a state, they would have one representative and two senators and one representative. They don't have that. I mean, the Constitution doesn't provide that Washington, D.C. will have representation in the House or the Senate. But when it comes to voting in presidential elections, they do have three electoral votes. Every state gets at least three, therefore, because no matter what your population is, how small it is, you're going to have one House member and two senators. Now, the current Electoral College has 538 electors in it. And that's because there are 435 House members, there are 100 senators, which adds up to 535, and then they have three more from Washington, D.C. So all total, there's 538 electors. To get a majority, you need 270. If you have 269, then you don't have a majority. You have only 50%. To get a majority, you have to have over 50%. So a majority is 270. A majority is needed to elect a president. So there have been a few times in history where there wasn't a majority in the Electoral College. And when there's not a majority in the Electoral College, we'll go over that in a minute. But in order to win the Electoral College in the election, you need at least 270 votes, a majority. Electoral votes are given to each state based on the state's number of federal representatives. As we said, how many House members and how many senators you have determines how many electoral votes you get. If no majority is achieved in the Electoral College, let's say the top vote getter only gets 250 votes, then the vote goes to the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, that's not what you really want to have, because what you have in the House of Representatives then is each state gets one vote, and then that vote determines who the president will be. So when it comes to apportionment fairness, there is some very, very lopsided voting power because of the Electoral College system. Given that giving each state for one vote for each representative gives a small states, the residents in those small states, tremendous advantage when it comes to voting power. Because if a very small state has 3 electoral votes, a state like Wyoming, which only has 1 representative, it has 2 senators, and it has less than 600,000 people in the population, a state like Wyoming, or around 600,000, they get about 1 vote for every 875 people. That seems like, okay, that's not a large amount of votes, but it's much better than, for instance, if you live in Texas, as we do. In Texas, you get 1 electoral vote for each 661,725 people. And that means that if you live in Wyoming, you have 3 to 4 times the voting power in the presidential election than the residents in Texas. So there's a clear apportionment fairness issue when it comes to Electoral College. California gets the least representation, least power per vote. They only get 1 vote for every 677,345. That's incredibly different than Wyoming. So Wyoming voters get about 3.5 times more voting power than Texas voters, and that's just a product of the way the Electoral College apportions itself. The winner take all. There's winner take all in each state with 2 exceptions. Okay, the 2 exceptions are Maine and Nebraska. Now, what they do is in each of these states is they give 1 electoral vote per representative. So in Maine, for instance, which has two House members, they give a vote to the winner of House District 1, another to the winner in House District 2, and then they give a vote for the entire state. So in Maine, they have where they have 3 electoral votes. It's often the case that 1 vote will go to the Republican and 2 votes will go to the Democrat, because they have 1 House district that is majority Republican and usually votes for the Republican presidential candidate. They have 1 that almost always votes for the Democratic candidate, and the state as a whole almost always votes for the Democratic candidate. But it splits the vote. The same thing goes on in Nebraska, which has 3 districts. 2 of those districts are very conservative Republican districts. The one district out to the far east of the state is Omaha, Nebraska. And in Omaha, that's a very liberal city in comparison to the other 2 districts. It's not unprecedented that Omaha goes for a Republican candidate, but most of the time they go for a Democratic candidate. So they tend to be a blue district. And so most of the time, Nebraska goes 3 to 1, 3 for the Republican, 1 for the Democrat. But every other state in the nation is winner take all. And that means that the winner is the candidate who gets the most votes. And that means, and make sure you understand this, it's not the candidate who gets a majority of the votes in the state. A lot of times a candidate will not get a majority of the vote in a state. They may only get 46, 48% and still have more votes than everyone else. That candidate inside the states will get all of the electoral vote. So it's not unprecedented. The candidates can have as low as 40% of the vote, but they have the most vote in the state because they have 40%, and none of the other candidates got up to 40%. In that case, that candidate with 40% of the vote gets all the electoral votes for that state. And this is done so that the state leaders because the state leaders want to maximize support for the preferred candidate in the state. There's been some move in Nebraska to try to move this to the same thing, where a winner-take-all system came very close to happening in 2024, but it did not. So Nebraska is still not a winner-take-all state, but most states do it because they feel like it maximizes their support and for their preferred candidate. By 1836, every state but South Carolina uses the winner-take-all system. South Carolina goes to it themselves later on. Today, only Maine and Nebraska are the states who do not use winner-take-all. Every other state is winner take all, and it's the plurality. Remember, it's the plurality winner. And that means they don't have to have majority. It's the one who gets the most votes. The plurality winner takes all of the electoral votes within the state. So now we know how the election occurs. How are electors chosen? The electors are generally chosen by the candidate's political party, but the state laws vary on how the electors are selected. And a lot of times it's handed to the party, and the party decides how the electors are selected. In Texas, people run for elector. They go to their state convention, and they'll have a caucus of their congressional district, and their congressional district will elect one person to be the elector. And if that person's party wins the election, then that person will go and represent that congressional district and cast that vote in the Electoral College. That vote in the Electoral College is the actual election. What goes on inside the states is not the direct election. That direct election isn't done until the Electoral College vote is taken later, after the general election that occurs in November. So state laws vary, but in most cases, what you do is you run for elector and you try to win. In almost every case, people do not become electors who haven't been very active in party politics. A lot of times, a presidential candidate will come in and they'll see somebody running for elector, and they'll tell the congressional districts, I don't want that person, because that person may decide, or they fear that person will decide not to vote for them, even though they won the election. And that's happened several times in the past. So I've seen it where a presidential representative would come in and say, look, I understand that this person is running for elector, but I do not trust them. I don't want them to be the elector. I would rather this person do it. But ultimately, it will come down to the vote. And 90% of the time, if the presidential candidate doesn't want you to run and be elector, regardless of how hard you campaign, you're not going to win, because ultimately the trust has to come down to you casting a vote for that presidential candidate. One vote can oftentimes throw the majority away and throw that election into the House. That would be critical. So that's the reason why the election of the electors for the presidential election, or the Electoral College, those elections are very important. Article 1, Section 3, the electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for two persons, of whom one shall not be inhabited of the same state with themselves. And this is a curious thing, because in most cases people know that Dick Cheney was actually a Texas representative, a Texas resident. He lived in Texas almost all the time. He lived in South Texas, and he loved to go hunting, and that was just he loved to just be down there and hunt. It was far South Texas. So when he became a candidate for vice president, he quickly decided he needed to move, and so he picked Wyoming. He moved to Wyoming, and that became his home state because of this Article 1, Section 3. This Article 1, Section 3 in the Constitution. Electors shall meet in their respective states and vote for two persons. One has to be from one state, the other has to be from the other. So George W. Bush was from Texas. He couldn't select another person from Texas to be his vice president. So Dick Cheney had to be from Wyoming or another state. And that's the reason why Dick Cheney relocated to Wyoming and became a Wyoming resident so that he could become vice president. This was also an issue in the 2024 election when Donald Trump won the nomination. People were discussing Ron DeSantis and Marco Rubio as possible VP candidates. Well, Ron DeSantis said right away he was not going to be the VP for Donald Trump because he was going to remain governor of Florida. That was what he wanted to do. Marco Rubio, on the other hand, it never came up, but he was senator from Florida. The only way he could become vice president would be to resign his Senate seat and move to another state. So that did not occur, and Donald Trump ended up picking Vance as his VP running mate. And so, because Donald Trump was a resident of Florida, Vance was a resident of Ohio, they adhered to the two-state rule. All tickets, president, vice president, from a party have to have members of two different states. Article 1, Section 3 also says if no person has a majority, then the House shall choose the president. But in choosing the president, the vote shall be taken by states, the representative from each state having one vote. That means Texas has one vote, California has one vote, and Wyoming has one vote. It's a crazy system, but that's what they did. And it's basically a tiebreaker now. Unless there's not a majority because a third party candidate gets in, then, if the Democrats and Republicans get all the votes, the only way that you can send that to the House if it's 269 to 269. But if some third party candidate gets votes, that can lower it, and you can actually have no majority, and it would go to the House. And then each state would have one vote. And that would almost certainly mean that a Republican would win because there's so many small states that are Republican dominated, and they would have one vote each, that tie would go to the Republicans. So it's a disadvantage to the Democrats right now, the way it sits. When they wrote the Constitution, they had no idea. They didn't even have idea that they would have two parties. But this is how they chose the president, by doing this. A majority of the states shall be necessary to select the president. There's been times in history when getting that majority of states to say, okay, I'll select this person as president has been very difficult because states have their own idea on who they want as president. So a lot of times when one person doesn't get a majority of the electoral vote, it's very hard for them to get a majority of the House on those single state votes. We'll talk about that in the slide coming up. So this procedure, this specific procedure was changed with the 12th Amendment in 1804. It was revised. And it was revised because of the election of 1800. In 1800, the election of 1800 was a rematch between the Federalists, which was Adams and Pinckney, who are at the top on the picture here. John Adams was the incumbent president. He was the second president, followed Washington into office. He had a 4-year term, and then he ran again in 1800. Two people ran against him. It was Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, because 12th Amendment said you're going to cast two votes. Well, typically what they had done in the past was they knew which one they wanted for president and which one they wanted for vice president. So somebody just withheld one vote for the vice president, and then made sure that the president got the majority of the vote. Well, for some reason in 1800, this didn't occur. And when the electors went to Electoral College, all 71 votes for Jefferson and Burr went to both candidates. And that meant there was a tie. And that Jefferson and Burr, Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson were tied for the lead. And therefore, it went into the House. And when it went into the House, it had many votes. And Alexander Hamilton, who was a former House member, is the first Secretary of the Treasury, a person who hated Thomas Jefferson, but hated Aaron Burr even more because they had a history in New York. Well, they went to the House, and then Alexander Hamilton used all his influence in the House to make sure that Jefferson finally come out on top. It took a majority of 26 votes, a majority of the vote to win, and Thomas Jefferson finally won the presidency, which was supposed to happen in the first place. But Aaron Burr decided that he had a shot, he was going to go for it. So since there was, when there's no majority, if one wins a majority of electoral votes, then the House of Representatives choose immediately by ballot the president, and the Senate shall choose the vice president. That is the new way that it's done. Each state will get exactly one vote. No vote for DC in this situation. A majority of 26 votes are needed to win. And after several votes in 1800, with great influence from Alexander Hamilton, Jefferson won the House vote, and Burr became the vice president. So Jefferson won, Burr became the vice president. That was the plan from the beginning, but it put a major rift between Burr and Jefferson after that. So Burr was vice president for 4 years, with Jefferson having given him no support whatsoever. And we know from constitutional history that the vice president really doesn't have any authority whatsoever. I mean, the only constitutional authority the vice president has is to break a tie in the Senate. So if the president wants the vice president off to the side, they can do that. That's happened often in history. John F. Kennedy pushed Johnson aside and kept him at a distance all the time. Other presidents, like Barack Obama, kept Joe Biden very close. So it just depends on the president. But that put a rift between Hamilton and Jefferson. So the 12th Amendment was revised in the Electoral College voting process. Electors now place a vote for the president and one vote for the vice president. And the tie-breaking procedure stays the same, where it goes to the House. But instead of having two votes for the president, you vote one vote for the president, one vote for the vice president. So if your ticket is for instance, Obama and Biden, you do one vote for Obama for president, one vote for Biden for vice president. If it's Trump Pence, one vote for Trump for president, one vote for Pence for vice president. That's how you do it now. And so that's what the Electoral College does. Controversial elections since 1800. We've had a lot of controversial elections since 1800. The most controversial elections occur when the candidate with the most popular votes does not win the election. And that's happened several times. I mean, it's happened several times in your lifetime. I mean, it's happened, in your lifetime. So you know that it's controversial. In 1824, John Quincy Adams, remember that John Adams was the second president, his son, John Quincy Adams, became the sixth president. He ran against Andrew Jackson. He got less votes than Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson had significantly more votes than him. But when it went to the House, John Quincy Adams started making deals. He negotiated and made a deal to win the House vote with no candidate getting a majority of the electoral vote. So despite Jackson having more popular votes and more electoral votes, he lost the election. This made Jackson very angry, and so Jackson ended up beating him 4 years later. But it did show what Jackson considered a flaw in the system. And there was a real divide in the country because Jackson was a real spoils politics guy, and it really changed how things ran after that. And it started to really develop the two-party system. That election clearly developed the two-party system, but it wasn't clear because remember, in the Constitution, when they developed the Constitution, people like James Madison, he did not want political parties. They thought political parties were a bad thing. So for the longest time, people didn't declare political parties. After Jackson won as a populist and basically threw all his friends into office, the two-party system started to develop. And it developed between the Democrats and the Whigs after that. So we had a two-party system after the 1824 election. And it's been a two-party system ever since because the system itself calls for two parties. The reason why we have two major parties is because the system really calls for two parties. And it forces a two-party coalition to occur because if you split your party, you almost always lose the election because the party that does not split, and it's happened, but the party that does not split ends up winning. So in 1876, maybe the most controversial election in American history, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes beat Democrat Samuel Tilden 185 to 184. Now remember, there were fewer states back then, so you didn't have to get to 270. You had to get to 185. It's the only time a loser received a majority of the popular vote and lost. That's never happened except in this case. A lot of people think, well, Hillary Clinton had a majority over Donald Trump and lost. She didn't have a majority of the vote in that election. She didn't get to 50%. So this case, though, was when Tilden actually had a majority of the vote and he lost. And there was many instances of voter fraud in this election, including like South Carolina had 101% turnout of eligible voters. So there was a lot of votes that got cast by people that were not eligible to vote. So Congress formed this 15-person election commission to settle the result. There were 20 disputed electoral votes. All 20 went to Rutherford B. Hayes. That's how he got it to 185, by getting all 20 of the disputed votes. But in return for having this Republican, remember, Republicans were the party of Lincoln. So in return for having this deal where Rutherford Hayes would be elected a president as Republicans, the Democrats said, we want Reconstruction to end. We want you to pull your forces out. Remember, this was 11 years after the Civil War, where the Confederacy lost. And basically, all the federal troops were withdrawn from Louisiana and South Carolina and ended Reconstruction. And all the states went back to being normal states, fairly normal states. There were sanctions against historically Confederate states after that, but for the most part, elections were returned to the South. So after the Civil War, many Republicans assumed office in the South. Many African American Republicans were elected in the South. After this, the troops pulled out, Reconstruction ended, and then the Democrats took over the South. Republicans were basically taken out as a second party. There was a one-party South, Louisiana, Alabama, Texas, all these southern states that were Confederate states were Democratic majority states, and whoever won the Democratic nomination won every election because Republicans could not compete. So this election was the most controversial, partly because Hayes won the election, but also partly because Reconstruction was done after a relatively short time, just over a decade. Reconstruction was done, and we went back to what ended up being a segregated South. So this was very historic. But we've had some other historic elections. John Kennedy beat Richard Nixon in 1960. I would be willing to bet a lot of money that John Kennedy did not win that election and that Richard Nixon actually won that election. In Illinois, there was a lot of voter issues going on there with Mayor Daley in Chicago running the Democratic Party and being friends with the Kennedys, making sure Illinois went over the top for Kennedy. Johnson doing the same thing in Texas, making sure Texas went over the top. We had some counties with twice as many votes as they had actual registered voters. It was very controversial. So to me, that was, I mean, I would easily bet that Nixon actually won in 1960. Of course, we had the 2000 election where Bush beat Gore by 534 votes. We had the hanging chads. We had pictures of people looking at cards saying, okay, I think the vote is actually this. And Florida was a real controversy. In the end, Bush took Florida. It was whoever took Florida won the election. And the Supreme Court actually came in and ruled Bush the winner. By all 9 of the Supreme Court justices actually turned their own ideology on its head, reversed their own ideology with the decision. For instance, conservative judges give states' rights. All the conservative judges took the states' rights away from Florida and said Bush was the winner. All the liberal justices said no. That's Florida has to have its autonomy on this, which is absolutely reverse from what they normally do. So it's really a bad day, in my opinion, for the Supreme Court. But in the end, the controversy was there, and Bush beat Gore. Of course, we all know about the 2016 election where Trump beat Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton protesting what went on in Michigan and Wisconsin. She had big issues with what was going on with the vote there, and she protested that election and tried to get it overturned. Then in 2020, Biden beats Trump. We know incredible amount of controversy there about the actions of Donald Trump, trying to make sure he won the election. January 6th riots occurred. So there's been a lot of controversial elections since 1800, and it's part of our country's history. So, we like to think that we have peaceful transfer of power. We have, incredible stability in our election system, but we have a whole history of electoral problems, and it's almost always the case. It's very difficult to have true and fair elections. It's very difficult, and there's other elections that I'm not even mentioning here. So please understand that election controversy is nothing new. It's something that we have to live with, and we have to work very hard to make sure that our elections are fair, and it's not an easy thing to do. Uh, when the Electoral College does not produce a winner, often it's because of third-party candidates. Now, that means that there's a danger when these third-party candidates get in. Remember, I mentioned before that third-party candidate. I mentioned before that. I'm sorry. I mentioned before that if there was not a majority in the Electoral College, that it goes to the House. So that's a danger right there. Sending the election to the House as a tiebreaker is always a danger. And I also mentioned before that the system calls for two parties. This system says, okay, you should have two parties. When you get a third party candidate in, it almost always steals votes from a party, from a candidate that's in a normal majority party. These candidates have no chance of winning. They put their names in because they want to, they're protest candidates. They don't like what's going on with the two parties. So they don't, in almost every case, have no chance of winning. The one exception might have been Ross Perot in 1992. Ross Perot had wide range support across the country. So he was by far the candidate who by far had the most third-party votes. He took a lot of votes from both candidates. A lot of people think that the Clinton-Bush election was actually the results were changed because of Ross Perot. The data doesn't show that. The data shows that Ross Perot stole just as many votes from Bill Clinton as he stole from George H.W. Bush. So even though Ross Perot was a really viable third-party candidate who got 19% of the vote in his last race, and it literally led the polls at one time, led the polling at one time as a candidate. Even though he was there, Ross Perot did not get any electoral votes. He never got the most votes in any state. And so, as a third-party candidate, as dangerous as third-party candidates are, and as dangerous as a candidate who can get 20% of the vote is, he did not actually change the results of any elections. And so, as a dangerous third-party candidate, that danger was quelled with him. However, a candidate like Ralph Nader, who got a very small percentage of vote, he almost certainly changed the results of the 2000 election. In Florida alone, if Gore would have won Florida instead of Bush, if Nader had not been in that election, almost all of Nader's votes would go to Gore. Even if it was 2-1, then Gore would have easily won Florida. It is clearly the case that Ralph Nader changed the results of the 2000 election. And he made it where Al Gore lost the election to George Bush because of his candidacy. So, third-party candidates are very dangerous in that they can change election results. A couple other special results were when these regional third-party candidates come in. This is when it's really dangerous. Regional third-party candidates who are going to actually carry states. Two of those candidates was Strom Thurmond and George Wallace. Strom Thurmond in 1948, he was senator to Dixiecrat Party. He stayed senator all the way into well into the 21st century. Lived to be 100 years old, and he was a segregationalist candidate, and he got a lot of the Southern Electoral College votes on this. And so, even though his vote total wasn't even close to being the Electoral College majority, he could steal enough votes in his election to where if that election is close, neither candidate in the Republican or Democratic Party would actually get a majority. And the same happened with George Wallace in 1968 when he was running against Nixon and Humphrey. Now, in the end, Nixon got a majority of the vote. Okay, in 1948, the majority of the vote went to Harry Truman. So these, even though they took states themselves, they didn't take enough of that vote to actually throw the vote into the House. But this is always a danger where third-party candidates who are regionally based can steal a lot of votes inside the region. Like with these two candidates, it was inside the solid South where they were stealing votes and actually winning states as segregationalist candidates. So regionally based third-party candidates steal votes from the other two candidates and cause the leadership can actually can lose a majority as a result of this. And so third-party candidates are often ideologically radical, and so they'll steal votes from Democrat or Republican candidates. When they do that, there's been a lot of third-party candidates, and most of them have the ability to steal votes. But these two actually had the ability to win states. The 1992 election, talk about that. We talked about that a little bit. Ross Perot got 19% of the vote. Got 19% of the vote, but you can see from the map, he didn't win a single electoral vote. He never got a majority in any state. So his third-party candidacy was not one that took electoral votes. And because he actually was kind of a moderate candidate, he probably might have stole more votes from Bush than he stole from Clinton, but he certainly did not steal enough votes from Bush to make it where Bush would have won a majority if he was not in the election. Or at least the data says that. Some people still believe that. I understand it's okay if you believe that. I don't believe it because the data just doesn't show that. The 1968 election, though, with George Wallace and the Nixon-Humphrey, you can see how many states George Wallace won. He won 13.5% of the Electoral College, or the vote, and he got Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama. He won all of those states, all of those southern states. He had that blocked. And so he won those states because he got a plurality of the vote in those states. And so he ended up stealing all those electoral votes. This could have easily thrown the election into where no one had a majority. But Nixon ended up getting that majority himself. You can see all the red states. The big advantage for Nixon was that he was from California. He was going to win California, which was at that time a swing state. So he won California as a resident of California, and he was very solid across the Midwest, winning Illinois, Ohio, those high electoral vote states at the time. And even though Humphrey, his vote was within 1% of Nixon's, Humphrey's vote was really condensed in New York and Pennsylvania area, up in Minnesota where he was from. And so he won a lot of states by a high margin and then lost a lot of states by a small margin. So in this case, the Electoral College was an advantage for Nixon. But Wallace, in winning all those electoral votes, I mean, you can see there he won 6, 10, 16, 26, 45 votes. 45 votes could easily make it where no one gets a majority. So, I mean, that was a scary election for a lot of people as a result. If it went to the House of Representatives, Wallace could actually win the election. They could actually select Wallace as one of the top 3 candidates. So this is an election where you see possible dangers. The other one is like 1948. Here in 1948, where Strom Thurmond was running, he only got 2.4% of the vote, but all that was in the South. You can see Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, which was his home state, was South Carolina. He got all that vote, 7.3% electoral vote, with just 2.4% of the total vote. So that's the danger of those third-party candidates. In this case, with Truman getting almost 50% of the vote, he easily won the election over Dewey, but because he had an easy majority of the electoral votes. But in other closer elections, it could result in that election going to the House. So the 2000 presidential election, which we talked about a little bit before, we can see Bush versus Gore, the Florida popular vote. You see it's only 534 votes difference. And this goes back to what I was talking about, where Nader almost certainly was the cause of Gore losing the election. Nader was a far left-wing candidate, much more liberal than Gore actually was. So Nader was probably stealing almost all of his votes from Gore. Now, there were some people who were voting for Nader who were actually Republicans, but those were in those conservative states like Texas and the states where Bush was going to easily win. So they didn't worry about Bush, but the reason why they voted for Nader is because they had a rule that if you got so much percentage of the vote, you would get actual federal financing for your election in the next election. So there were people who were voting for Nader, even though Nader was as far from them as they could ever be, because they wanted him to keep getting financed so he can run in the election and steal votes from more Democrats. If Nader stayed in the elections all the time, winning 100,000 votes, that would make it very difficult for Democrats to win. And so some Republicans voted for Nader. But in close states like Florida, that wasn't going on. What was going on was people were voting for the candidate of their choice because Florida was the swing state at that time. And so those 97,000 votes, I would guess that around 90,000 of those would have been for Gore had Nader not been on the ballot. That's the other danger of third-party candidates. They can steal votes and cause it where the actual preferred candidate doesn't actually win the state. So, 2016 presidential election, how did Donald Trump win it? And you can see here that he won it by taking Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. Look at those three states up there, 10, 16, and 20. Those were solid Democratic states. And Hillary Clinton basically put those states in her pocket and thought, okay, I've had these states won. Michigan especially. I remember her husband, Bill Clinton, saying, you need to go campaign in Michigan. And she was going, Michigan's mine. It's not an issue. So, if you looked at the Vegas odds on who was going to win this election, it was between 80 and 90% that Hillary Clinton was going to win this election. It was a shock that Donald Trump won. He was behind in all the polls. It was a shock that he won. He did not win the popular vote. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by a significant margin. See, 48.2% to 46.1%, 2% more vote than Donald Trump. So this election is a case where the majority vote, it's a solid case when majority vote does not elect a president. It's the Electoral College, and it's the system that elects the president. And so the system itself. Now, am I saying that Clinton would have won if it would have been popular vote? No, because the dynamic changes. If it was popular vote, she probably would have won instead of Trump. But the dynamic changes. The Electoral College is a system where you campaign according to the college. Donald Trump didn't even bother with California because California was gone. California was not going to vote for Donald Trump. And the same with Oregon and Washington. Those three West Coast states on the Pacific Ocean are far left-wing states. So he just, he said, it's okay. I'm going to lose those states by a large amount. I'm going to go over and campaign, make sure I'm solid in the South, grab Pennsylvania, which was kind of a home state for him because he went to college in Pennsylvania, Michigan and Wisconsin, which were Union states that were typically solid Democrat. He stole a coalition, which was the white middle class worker, mainly white middle class men who worked. They went over to Trump. Clinton did not get those candidates, those votes. So that's how Donald Trump won this election. And I see there were two faithless electors. So Donald Trump had two people who were supposed to cast that vote for him who did not cast that vote for him. Hillary Clinton had 5 of those. People who said they would vote for Hillary Clinton won as electors and then went and cast a vote for somebody else. So that is another danger in the Electoral College. How did Trump win when he lost the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes? Well, in the West and the rural suburban South, he was well liked. And I say West, I'm not talking about West Coast. I'm talking about those West states, Arizona, Wyoming, Colorado, and so forth. In the West, as a region, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, he was very well liked. Montana, Idaho. That was a solid for him. Significantly better than Romney in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and Arkansas. The South loves Donald Trump. So in the South, he's very strong. He lost some of the vote in the southern states with the well-educated urban Republicans, but not enough to lose those states. So, like for instance, people with college degrees tended not to vote for Donald Trump. He lost some of those voters. Texas was 7 points worse than Romney, and Georgia was 3 points worse than Romney. So in Texas, Romney was more popular than Trump, and the same with Georgia. Trump did gain 2 points in Florida to win by 1 point. And so he did gain some points in Florida. He ended up making Florida his home state. His home state was New York. He moved it to Florida. He sacrificed California. He lost by 4.3 million votes in California. So outside of California, Trump had the majority of the vote. So Romney lost California by 3 million. In California, they really do not like Donald Trump. 4.3 million behind. But that wasn't where he basically gave that away and won a majority in the other states to be able to steal the Electoral College. Outside of California, Trump won by 1.4 million votes. So that's how he won in 2016. Trump stole the industrial states, did better than Romney in Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania, and he was able to change the white working class vote in his favor. He made this message basically, and you see this chart a lot with equality versus equity and so forth. And I mean he was able to hit the strings of the white working class workers that the Democratic Party wasn't worried about them. The Democratic Party didn't care about them. Who they cared about was the people, the minority people, and they were struggling, and the Democratic Party was doing nothing. And he was able to turn that vote over, and that vote has stayed with him. He's able to keep that white working class vote, especially among men. Not as much among women, but especially among men. He's been able to keep that white working class vote. That college educated vote, though, he's not able to do that. And so he's lost some of that college educated vote. He's won a whole lot of that white working class vote. Reform options, because a lot of people just don't like the Electoral College. And I'm always one who says it's not going to be that easy to change it. One, because the Constitution doesn't allow you to change it. It's not easy to change anything in the Constitution. It takes an amendment, and to get an amendment, you need a supermajority. A lot of people just say go with the popular vote. The problem is that every state has different election laws, and every state, by the Constitution, runs elections. There's not a uniform way to run elections. So when it comes to registration, some states let you register on the day of the election. Other states like Texas, you have a 30-day waiting period. You got to register, 30 days before the election, you have to register, and in order to be eligible to vote on election day. So it's not easier to vote in Texas. It's harder to vote in Texas. But that's if you're doing the popular vote, then those people are at a disadvantage in Texas in comparison to other states where you just walk in, register, and vote. There's also different issues with mail-in ballots, length of time voting, early voting days. Some states let you vote for 3 or 4 weeks early voting. Some states have very short early voting places. Some states make you go to your precinct to vote. Other states let you vote at any precinct, regardless of where you live. So there's a lot of different rules in the states, and they're not uniform across the country. So the popular vote winner, a lot of people say just take the popular vote winner. There are issues. What happens if there's a bad storm? What are you going to do? You're going to change the rules and say, okay, but we're going to let these people vote later? That's going to be a problem. Third-party candidates will come out of the woodwork in a new system where the popular vote wins. You're not going to get a majority of the popular vote anymore because third-party candidates are going to go out and steal a lot of the popular vote from a lot of the other candidates. So it's just not that easy. It's just saying whoever gets the popular vote wins. So you have a lot of issues when you just use the popular vote. As far as state law reform, you can get rid of winner take all states. Some people say that, but then you have the same issues that you have with the popular vote. Third party candidates are going to come in and steal a district. It's a lot easier to steal a vote from a House district than it is from an entire state. Ross Perot would have got a lot of votes if it would have been where you split the vote. 19% of the vote would have went to Ross Perot. Then what are you going to do? He's just going to throw it into the House again. So it's not an easy way. There's not an easy way to reform the Electoral College. Then if you need a recount, what if you need a recount on the popular vote? You're going to recount the entire country? It's going to be impossible to do that. So the Electoral College at least gives you some simplicity, some declaration of a winner, even if the winner isn't the most popular candidate. So you can get rid of the winner take all states. You have the same issues. You can force a majority vote win in all to get all the states' electoral votes. You can split the vote if no majority occurs. Have a runoff between the top two popular vote recipients. Maybe you can do that, but then you have to have a whole election after that. So the popular vote is not an easy reform. It's just not an easy reform. And there's a lot of things that can happen that cause the popular vote to be a real mess. Another one is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. By far the most popular reform is these states commit not to give their votes to the winner inside their state, but to give their votes to the popular vote winner. And so I fear that you're going to have the same issues come up. If we get this National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, you're going to have some third-party candidates come in and mess things up. But it does allow you to have a popular vote winner actually get the election. And what the state does is say, okay, we commit, whoever wins the popular vote, we're going to give all of our votes to that winner. Most of these states that are doing it are Democratic states, because right now looks like the Electoral College favors Republican candidates over Democratic candidates, because we have the big, massive voting population in California, Oregon, and Washington that's clearly Democrat. And that vote is getting diluted because of the winner-take-all system. I have my doubts that this will ever occur, because I don't think most states will ever get to the point where they say, we're not going to take the winner of our state. We're going to take the winner of the popular vote. And I'm not sure if it could even actually meet constitutional muster if it does. As of September 2024, 17 states and Washington, D.C. have adopted legislation for the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. They represent 209 electoral votes. 4 states, Nevada, Michigan, North Carolina, and Michigan, are currently considering it. But even those 4 states will only total 261 if they come through. 270 are needed. None of the rest of the states are even considering it right now. So I think it's a long shot to ever occur any time in our lifetimes, including your lifetime. The constitutionality is also an issue. Article 2, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution gives states the authority to determine how their electoral votes are awarded. From this standpoint, the Interstate Compact is a viable thing. So each state shall appoint, in a matter of that the legislature thereof may direct, a number of electors. So if the state legislature says we're giving all our votes to the popular vote, Article 2, Section 1 clarifies it looks like that they can do that. However, the compact clause of Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution states, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter into any agreement or compact with another state. And that would tell me that that's not going to be constitutional. So even if the interstate compact occurs, it's going to have to end up going to the Supreme Court to determine if it's constitutional or not. So right now, our Supreme Court that we have currently would declare it unconstitutional, I believe. But that could change in the future. So the constitutionality of this compact, this interstate compact, is still up in the air as well. The pros of the compact, you don't have any more swing states. So right now, the swing states are the ones where the campaigns are. The rest of them are taken for granted. You have a lot higher turnout because in the states where the presidential vote's already determined, what's the use of going to the polls? If the only vote you care about is the presidential vote and you live in California, don't worry about it. Stay home because the Democrat will win. And the same is true in the Republican states like Kansas or Wyoming. If you know, if if you want the Republican candidate, don't worry about it. Just sit home. Your vote isn't going to matter. Uh, you have better proportional voting power. Remember the issue we had with Wyoming. With Wyoming, they're getting a lot more voting power than California or Texas because they have a small state. That would go away with that. The cons, there's a big focus on urban areas, the rural areas, because the population density will be where the campaigns are. National level recounts. What are you going to do with that? That's going to be difficult. Third party candidates will have a lot better chance to disrupt your elections. Electoral votes will be awarded to a candidate who did not win a majority in their state. How do you feel about that? If you voted for a candidate, your candidate won your state, but the electoral votes went to the candidate with the most popular vote. How would you feel about that? I think there'll be a lot of lawsuits on that. And then there'll be constitutional questions, as we just talked about, the interstate compact and the election of the state electors. Those will definitely be issues on this. Want to thank you for allowing me to make this presentation today. I hope that you're having a great semester, as I said before. Hope you understood the video and that if you have any questions, I'm always here to answer your questions. Have a good day and have a good semester.